Thank you. Hello. Good morning. Good morning. This TED Talk, Hed Talk, entitled the Digitalization of Our Brains by Dr. Laura Joy Boulos. And I'm from UNESCO. Allow me to introduce very briefly about Dr. Laura's bio. She is an associate professor in neuroscience at St. Joseph University in Beirut, Lebanon, and an independent life science consultant and an entrepreneur in the biotech industry in Paris, France. Her research uses algorithmic approaches to understand decision-making process in times of turmoil and uncertainty, with a focus on decision-making and substance use. You cannot hear, sorry. Decision-making and substance use disorders. She also recently co-founded SciDip, SciDip, a startup that partners up with consulting firms and VCs in the health sector to provide them with fundamental research analysis with a long-run aim to make research accessible and useful to all. So, Dr. Laura Joy Boulos, floor is up to you, and please take over the session.
Thank you very much for this great introduction. Thank you for being here online and offline, and we'll be talking a lot about the difference between online and offline. If I start by asking you a definition of the Habenula, you will most probably tell me to come again. But then if I spell it out for you, Habenula, you will certainly Google it. A few years ago, back when Google wasn't a thing, what we did is search for other resources. We would go to the closest library, ask a close friend, a family, anyone we deemed fit to help. The way we searched for this information shaped our brain functioning and cognition. Today, the internet, digital technologies also shape our brains, behavior, and cognition, except they do it differently. My name is Laura Joy Boulos. I am a doctor in neuroscience, and this is precisely what I want to talk to you about today. How do these digital technologies impact the way our brain functions, and how can we integrate these changes into the futures of higher education? Our brains, are the interface between us and the rest of the world. They are the physical organ that underlies our cognitive functions and executive functions. That is the way we process things, are impacted by things, memorize them, or even anticipate them. Throughout our evolutionary history, our cognitive systems have been altered by the advent of technologies such as primitive tools or even spoken language. And a few decades ago, the internet, digital technologies in general, emerged as the latest technologies that were poised to deeply reshape human cognition. When there's a big change, the first question that comes is it for better or for worse? Is it something that I want to encourage or hedge against? We know that the acceleration of digital technologies is correlated with an increase of the prevalence of reported mental health disorders. And this is specifically the case in young adults, obviously a population of interest in the case of higher education. This could, however, be explained, or it could be partially explained at least, by the rise in interest around mental health. And it definitely does not mean that digital technologies are all bad. As a matter of fact, there is little utility in labeling them in general as good or bad. The digital genie is out of the bottle, and efforts to put it back there will more probably not succeed. No, the idea, as I was saying at the beginning, is more to understand how our cognitions are reshaped and how we can integrate and apply these changes in real life and in higher education. So it will be the first part and the second part of my talk. I thought a bit about what are the major changes that happen with digital technologies, and I've decided to focus on the 5 major impacts of digital technologies on cognitive executive functions and the brain. That is attention, memory, information processing, reward processing, and multitasking. Let's start with attention. Multiple studies have drawn a link between extensive screen time. I can see a couple of you on screens. I know that online people are on screens. So extensive screen time. And obviously the COVID has accelerated this as well. And then a decrease in sustained attention. Sustained attention being the major symptom of ADHD. The reason behind this link is still unclear, but it could be attributed to an increase in a sort of overwhelming information processing. What it means is that instead of, for now, for instance, just focusing on what I'm saying, or instead of maybe after this talk just sitting and talking, enjoying a conversation with someone, we find ourselves scanning, scrolling on apps, on Facebook, Instagram, different applications, mobile applications, on our computers, etc., in different activities that force us to jump from one thing to another and obviously switch our attention rapidly between these things. Now, while this is true, I mean, it is obviously true that we spend more time on these different tasks and our sustained attention is reduced. It is also true that these same technologies have the potential to enhance some aspects of attention processes. It is the case, for instance, with video games. I don't know if there are any gamers among you, if your friends, your kids maybe are gamers. If you have any gamers around you, you've probably noticed how they tend to scrutinize very small details because their visual attention is improved, and they have this ability to fairly quickly respond to them because their reaction time is improved. So if we want to summarize about attention, there is reduced sustained attention, but increased visual attention and improved reaction time. Now, memory, I see that the visuals are not extremely good. They're Enki Bilal illustrations, and it's really a comic book writer that I really admire. So about memory, the internet, digital technologies, with the wide and fairly accessible ocean of information that they represent, form or serve as a form of what we call external transactive memory. A transactive memory happens when a group of people communicate and share information amongst each other. And the information is distributed in a way that each member holds only partial and bits and pieces of information, not the whole thing. If we translate that to the internet, what happens is that the internet holds all the information, and users have little to no responsibility regarding the content of the information. The only responsibility that users have, individuals have, is to know how to access this information, where it is located. So in a way, what's happening is that we're moving from a content-based memory to a memory that is more about processes, about knowing how to find an information. And so perhaps what is important to mention is that, because someone asked me at the beginning of the talk, does it mean that you're going to criticize digital technologies? Again, it's not always all bad, and this externalization of our memory is not necessarily maladaptive. I see that some of you are taking notes. For a long time, humans have used external tools such as taking notes, such as calendars, shopping lists, to sort of form an extension of our memory, of our cognition. So in a way, what's happening when we're using these external tools, and even more so with the case of internet as this external transactive memory, what we're doing is that we're freeing up some space in our cognition. We're freeing up some cognitive space. And this brings me to one of the major concepts in cognitive neuroscience, the concept that you probably heard of cognitive load. Cognitive load refers to the limits of our cognitions, the limits of our memory. What does it mean? The way our bodies get tired, probably now you're starting to get hungry, starting to have signals from your body. At the end of the day, at the end of the week, at the end of right before vacation, our bodies are tired. And it's exactly the same with our cognitive functions. They get tired, they even get exhausted. They need to be reset, reloaded. And at some point, if you're memorizing too many things, paying attention to many things, taking too many decisions, then this cognitive load is getting full. So in a way, by externalizing, by outsourcing our memory, what we're doing is freeing up subcognitive space for other cognitions, which is obviously interesting. Then maybe one last point that is interesting about memory is how it goes back to what we were saying about video games with attention. It's how all digital technologies and digital tools have been identified for their potential as reinforcement, as their potential in brain training and memory training. We know, for instance, that some aspects and different aspects of memory can be improved through computerized games, for instance, in aging adults of 80 plus, for instance, or even in some pathological conditions in what we call mild cognitive impairment. Mild cognitive impairment is the condition that precedes Alzheimer's disease or other types of dementia as well. So we know that these computerized games can improve. So we're using, again, digital tools to improve our cognition. So to sum up the point about memory, there is this external transactive memory that comes with digital technologies. And on one hand, there is the fact that we're externalizing, so we're moving from content-based memory to a sort of content-based memory to a sort of process-based memory, but then we're being able to train the machine at different time points, at different ages, and even in pathological conditions. The third cognition that I wanted to talk about is information processing, and perhaps the biggest change that is cultivated by digital technologies and specifically the internet is this shallow mode of information processing. The shallow mode of information processing is characterized by scanning behavior, by keyword spotting, by selective reading, by reduced contemplation. You probably notice when you read these different articles online or whatever content you're looking for, you tend to scan to find specific words. And what is interesting is that many researchers found that there are some features of the digital environment that contribute to building this shallow mode of information processing. One of them, for instance, are hypertexts. Hypertext, you're reading a text, and you're forced sort of by these links, by this, to ask yourself questions. Instead of just reading the text, you find yourself wondering, should I open a new tab? Should I go to this link on another page or on the same page? Should I abandon the reading of my paragraphs because maybe it's less interesting than what we're offering on the menu on the same paragraph? So there's really the fact that because these hypertexts are imposed on us when we're reading, we're forced to make choices. It eats up some of the cognitive load, and then again, it sort of contributes to this shallow mode of information processing. Another feature of the digital environment that contributes as well to this shallow mode is the fact that this pool, this ocean of information is accessible effortlessly. And I emphasize on effortlessly. We know that the information is there. How hard it is to Google a Habenula definition, what is the Habenula? The information is there, and the fact that it is there makes it less interesting for us to engage in elaborative processing that are going to be the base of obviously putting an element in our long-term memory, but also very simply, deep reading. And perhaps this is the biggest risk of the shallow mode of information processing. Personally, when I hear shallow, I know there's at least one risk somewhere. But for the shallow mode of information processing, perhaps this is the biggest risk, is that it could impair in the long run our capacity to deep read. And deep reading is the basis for critical thinking, for reasoning, for analysis, for all different analyses. I guess it's easy to grasp the danger about it. But again, as I was saying beforehand, there's more often than not an upside. And in this case, the upside is because we're getting a flood of information and we're looking for a lot of information, all this information sort of pushes our intelligence to be more flexible, more fluid. So if we want to sum it up about information processing, it's getting shallower, but more flexible, more fluid. Then the fourth cognition, and it's perhaps my favorite because during my PhD, you're right, thank you so much. I tend to do this, thank you. During my PhD and my postdoctoral studies, I worked on rewards because I find it fascinating how we operate based on rewards, even despite our consciousness sometimes. But with reward processing, what is interesting is that the internet and digital technologies offer very stimulating and rewarding experiences. I mean, if we look at the typical content, videos, music, games, social information, it is all inherently pleasurable by nature. It feeds our hunger for connectedness and our appetite, let's say, for adventure. I mean, even in real life as well. If we go shopping, if we play games, if we have social interactions or even sexual interactions, they're extremely gratifying and often associated with overuse. So building and sort of leveraging on the internet's infrastructure, these desirable activities and content become even more conveniently accessible. And to top that, what the internet, what digital technologies are doing, it's that they're distributing rewards on what we call a variable ratio schedule. A variable ratio schedule, what it means is that, maybe it means two things. The first one is that the rewards are going to be unpredictable. Typically with apps, with Facebook, maybe more Instagram today, we get notifications, we get likes. So who doesn't get excited about a small thing? And you're like, oh, who is it? Is it the person that I'm expecting? Is it? So there's really the fact that it's unpredictable. And then the second thing is the magnitude of the rewards, even if we predict the reward. I mean, again, going back to these Google searches engines or different types of search engines, I tap again my habanula. What is the habanula? And I find exactly what I'm looking for. I'm like, this is exactly the information I wanted. Magnitude of the reward. So magnitude, unpredictability. And building a structure that is based on reward is obviously going to increase our reward-seeking behavior, our reward-seeking everything, actually. Everything is going to be dependent on these rewards. To an extent that what is happening is that our impulsivity is increasing, and our preference, at least, for immediate rewards is also increasing. Immediate rewards despite potential losses. So to sum it up, but again, there are so many things to say about reward and digital technologies, but to sum it up, the whole system is altered with a preference for small immediate rewards. The last cognition that I wanted to talk about is multitasking. Multitasking refers to, at least scientifically, to the capacity to perform two or more tasks at the same time, or the capacity to switch rapidly between these tasks. The internet, digital technologies in general, mirror a drastic increase in these multitasking processes, and it's directly associated with an increased distractibility, which again, common sense, you're doing many things, one thing is going to distract you from the other. It's also associated with increased error rates. I always have trouble with my R's in English, like many Arabs, error rates. But yeah, so increased error rates, again, common sense. You're doing many things at the same time, more chances for mistakes. Then the last thing, and this is perhaps what is the most worrisome, I would say, is that when you're multitasking and you're engaging in all these multitasking processes and behavior, what's happening is that your capacity to inhibit distractors is being reduced. I guess a good situation maybe is when you're trying to focus on a given task on your computers, and then you try to focus, and you I don't know, your cat passes by. I have a cat, I love cats. Her name is Zoe. I think it's important to mention her. and then obviously cats, and or your partner, or the door rings, or even again the ting of your Instagram. Focusing back to the task that you're performing is not always easy, because our capacity, again, to reduce distractions, to distractors, to reduce the noise in the background is really decreasing with digital technologies. Now, again, more often than not, there's an upside. The upside with multitasking, and precisely with media multitasking, is that it gives us the capacity to integrate multiple sources of information. Again, common sense, but also apart from the fact that it's common sense, I find it personally really interesting. And I would say that if if we have to sum it up, yes, digital technologies can be harmful to our cognitive functions, but then there's this thing that is happening, is that the way we think in general is sort of linear. It's mirrored on our language, and I can only say one word at a time. But then the fact that we're working with digital technologies, and precisely with the internet, it's building a sort of rhizome-based way of thinking that allow us to connect ideas among them, to make more links, more connections, etymologically, nets that are intertwined. There's really this capacity that we're gaining in having more of seeing more the bigger picture, imagining it more, integrating it more. And it's again based on this media multitasking, where you're integrating different sources of information and thinking with different elements instead than just or limiting yourself to a linear way of thinking things. So that's about the 5 major cognitions that are impacted by digital technologies. Obviously, the list is longer. For instance, I hope that you're not among them, but sleep disturbances are increased, self-control is decreased. One of the major impacts is less cognitive, more emotional. Social intelligence, emotional intelligence is decreased. Very simple reason for that. More time online, less time face-to-face. A good example is right now, obviously. I've been to many conferences. I was like, oh, many chairs, only a few people. Obviously there's this online interactions that are taking over and reducing, in a way, our social intelligence, emotional intelligence. But again, so these were the 5 major cognitions that are impacted and I decided to focus on. But then the idea and the main question is, okay, but now what? What do we do with this information? How do we translate it in real life? How do we apply this in higher education? Because it is what it is about today, at least. And the researcher in me was like, I don't know. Too soon to know. And then, as you were saying, the entrepreneur and the consultant in me got really excited about having to talk about direct impact and how to apply it in real life. And I wrote down a list of 10 bullet point recommendations, I would say. Disclaimer, they're coming right out of my crazy digitalized brain. But here they are. The first one is to redirect the use of digital tools for academic purposes. Modern students have way more to do than just listen to their professors teaching in class. I personally teach classes at university, and I see my students web browsing while listening, and then some even add me on Instagram during the classes. I'm like, yo, I can see you. But it's not enough. It's not enough. It's still what is happening. And I think a good way, without going into the details of how it could be harmful for their retention processes, memory processes, and in general learning processes, a good way to do it is to redirect the use of these tools. Tell them, okay, let's use the tools. Going back to my first question, what is the habenula? Find the best treat on the habenula. You have 10 minutes. And then really trying to integrate these tools, and then sort of putting a hard stop to it and asking them to put their phones or whatever they're using away. So that was the first one. The second one is to foster adaptive learning. It goes in the same vein, and maybe to provide navigational support, because we can't necessarily expect, I mean, obviously we've all learned naturally how to use these tools, but we can't expect our students or anyone to do it the way we want them to do it if we don't tell them what is the way that we want them to do it. So there's that. Then there is, and definitely in the same vein, to allow selectivity. I was telling you that my list of 10 bullet points is non-exhaustive, and it is. And I don't think it's a bad thing to be non-exhaustive. I think selectivity should be encouraged. It's something it's actually interesting to understand how the information was selected, how resources were selected, and why they were selected. And then it's to not expect more. I felt it for me, at least as a professor. I was expecting more from my students. I was like, the information is online. Why didn't you access it and include it in your work? Well, just because they have access to it doesn't mean they will access it. They can't access everything. Again, it goes back to my selectivity point. So why did I start sort of expecting more? I don't think it's necessary, or I don't think it's a good thing, actually, to expect more just because it's there. And it goes back to maybe the second point, but to define the use of these search engines. We don't want the students in the future to start using internet to be like, who am I for a philosophical essay? There are uses for these search engines, typically what is the Habenula, and other uses that are better not to be, not to happen at all. Then maybe one way to do this is to, and I'm not sure about this one, to be honest, but I do think that the discussion and the question should be out there. Should we allocate specific time slots for different activities in relation with digital tools? Should we say, okay, so now we're using this amount of time for web browsing or searching and different aspects of information seeking, and then this other amount of time for analysis, even if this includes some machine learning or some digital tools, but maybe not the same ones, not connected ones in the same way at least. And then even some time, and I did not talk about this aspect of the default mode. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the aspect of default mode. Basically, a good way to understand default mode is maybe to think of a brain resting. I personally, again, Zoe, my cat, I sometimes, actually very often, see her staring into what seems to be nothing, probably her default mode. My default mode is to zone out for a couple of minutes. I don't know what yours is, but it's really this idea of brain resetting. And in a way, it's very linked to the cognitive load that we were talking about beforehand. This is the only one promise. I hate writing too many words on my slides, but it's maybe to moderate the detrimental effects of multitasking on learning by implementing specific goals and motivations. So it's really to link the use of these tools and the use of multitasking, because as we said, there are some positive aspects about it, but to link the use of these processes, if not tools, for specific purposes, to know why we're multitasking when we are multitasking. And it brings me to this idea of embracing inclusivity. It's vague, but what I mean here is that we have different cognitive styles. It's important to know that we don't, the same way that we have so many differences as humans, we also have different cognitive styles. It's important to sort of be aware of these differences, be aware of our own cognitive style for a start, how it's being shaped by the internet or other digital technologies, because it is being shaped by them. And then lastly, where we position ourselves compared to others. How are others impacted compared to us? And it brings me to for me, one of the most important things, and goes back to this idea of rhizome thinking. One of the most important things about digital technologies is to think collective. Again, we can't, just because there is all this information there, it doesn't mean that we can read it all and even less analyze it all. So the idea then is how can we use the fact that there is all that is happening? How can we use it personally, and where do we want to position ourselves in the more global projects that are happening out there? And to maybe feel that we are interconnected and feel the impact that we are having on others. Connectivity is often associated with some spiritual connotations, perhaps, and some political connotations as well that I really like. Again, as a person from a developing country, I think it's very important to notice that I'm privileged enough to live in Paris today. And when I'm in Paris, I need to realize that because some people in Lebanon are suffering the way they're suffering today, I am able to do what I'm doing in Paris. And again, it doesn't mean that the internet is only focusing on the political aspect of connectivity and of collectivity, but we are building collective projects with digital tools. And I think it's one of the main important things to take into account for their impact on our cognition. There is this very famous saying that at least is very famous among us neuroscientists that goes this way. It's neurons that wire together fire together. I see that there's a neuroscientist among us apart from myself. Or at least, yeah, probably. But well, it can have many interpretations, and I'm not going towards the neuronal interpretation, but here what it means as well is, again, this idea of connectivity. And if we're wired together on the internet, in the digital environment, then we're probably firing ideas and projects and different things at the same time. And again, taking this into account could make us use these digital technologies more appropriately, more conveniently, at least for cognitive functions. And the last thing, it's less of a recommendation and it's more of a general consultation, remark. I've noticed even in my own way of approaching things that we tend to talk about brain and tech in a very with a very dualistic approach, which is fine. I guess we tend to simplify things and being very binary, and then the internet and digital technologies are very binary, or used to be at least the basis of them. But still, there is little interest. It's not very utility or interest in being like that's good, that's bad. These are the risks. These are the benefits. Brain and tech, because today there is a continuity. They're both on the same continuum. That's for sure. And there is a unity. There is a unified identity. And the only way to maybe make the best out of it is to see things as a unified concept rather than how is one impacting the other. So even if my short talk was about how one impacts the other, there's more this unified concept that is coming, and that's what's interesting, to see how both together, how brain and technologies together are impacting the world, basically. And yeah, the Habenula. It's a tiny brain structure, sort of, if you do this and this, you end up on it. And among other things, so I did my PhD on it, but among other things, it underlies reward processing, aversive processes as well, and some cognitive functions. Thank you very much. I don't know if someone wants to discuss a specific point, or if we're good.
Working. Thank you very much. That was very entertaining, because you might have noticed it is a very close area for me. I'm cognitive psychology, but coming from neurology, so yeah, that's an area. And I was thinking about the first point you talked about, sustained attention. You mentioned that could be, let's say, connected to cognitive load. I was thinking maybe that could also be kind of related to that reward system, with things that are pleasant and they keep popping up, like all those interventions that we are not longer capable of inhibiting. Why that is important to me, why I ask about that, because, well, nowadays we say that children are capable of keeping attention for 10-20 minutes. In this conference, we're having normal sessions like 2 academic hours straight, 4 times a day. So the question is for that new generation, whether we see that they are weak, so we give them wheelchair, or we train them to make them stronger. And that also goes back to the question where that inability for sustained attention comes from. If that is from something like rewards, then suggestions of directing it to good contents, maybe less of that stimulation, because stimulation by itself is also like one of the reasons, would be a good thing. If it is more like cognitive overload, then maybe there are other ways to train. So what would you think, what could be for us a way to go with this decreased span of attention? And
I definitely think your question is fascinating, and unfortunately, I definitely won't have a perfect answer at all. I'm thinking out loud. I do agree with you. I think that our attentional processes are affected by different things, and there are different reasons why our sustained attention is reduced with digital technologies. I also think that it's maybe, as you were saying, but maybe a mix of our cognitive load in a way that is reduced, and in another way, what I think is these rewards. I used to laugh about. I actually built an app, a phone app that the name is I Decide, and obviously it's an app that sort of monitors your decisional process, your decisions, basically, minor and major, and how to maybe avoid having many minor decisions, like what am I going to eat. I personally spend like lots of time 10 whole minutes deciding whether I want this sandwich, and then I went out and I was like, oh my God, there were food trucks as well, I missed that. But obviously it's taking up some cognitive load. But I do think that rewards, and specifically in mobile apps and in different digital environments, are there because they know that the cognitive load is limited. Well, we're putting them because we know that cognitive load is limited, and we're like, we want this cognitive load to be allocated to us rather than to something else. So it's like, hey, I'm here, and so it's so ridiculous, actually. You see all the things that corporate industries or even small startups are putting in place to attract our attention. It's really like, attention whores. Like apps are being like, oh, look, I'm here. You're like, yeah, I know you're here. This is why I downloaded you. Let me use you when I need you. So obviously what I'm saying for now is just that I agree with you, and I think it's a bit of both, and reward is being used to sort of push you to allocate a certain amount of your cognitive load towards this specific app or environment and whatnot. Now, how to do with our generation, with new generations that are on their way, that we're facing, talking to, and who are obviously having a limited sustained attention compared to other generations. I wouldn't have a perfect answer, but I do think that it's somewhere in between. Like draining is probably never a good thing, and maybe accepting fully is also not a good thing, but somewhere in between, because accepting that if we want to include digital technologies, and again, there's little use in ignoring the fact that they're here, maybe it's really juggling with, like, maybe accepting that sustained attention is going to be decreased, and maybe shortening the periods of time where people have to focus, but then also doing it to a certain extent and not fully, and maybe also having rules, although I'm not a huge fan of rules. Ideally, if we could all be anarchists, it would be amazing, but maybe even putting some rules of like turning the phone off, putting it away, and this kind of like really having moments where it's only about focusing on one task, and maybe trying to lobby towards this, towards having some time slots. Again, the idea of time slots, I haven't thought it fully at all, actually. But I do think that it seems alluring, it seems enticing and interesting to be able to allocate some time slots. This is one thing. Now, I don't know if you have ideas in mind while you were asking the question. Do you know personally what you would think would be a good... Sorry, I'm throwing back the hot potato.
I was getting quite conflicting messages throughout the conference these days, because when we talk from academic or quality side, we usually get the message that we should roll back to face-to-face. Right. When we hear presentations from technology, we hear another thing like, students like it, 80% want it, and so on. So they want to be reminded of what they have to do and so on, but what does it mean to be reminded that you have to hand in your, let's say, coursework? So it is not that teacher takes decisions for you, but it is software that takes decisions for you, and you have that stimulation. So for me, that is quite an unanswered question as well. But what I feel that actually what you mentioned, deep thinking, if you agree with shorter terms of attention span, is going to suffer. And those transversal competences like critical thinking, they also are going to suffer, because you simply Google, where is that critical, where is that deep thought. But the problem with, let's say, putting one task for students, and that's why I asked about, let's say, reward versus just cognitive load, is that if we have a notion that it is boring, like not depletion of willpower, but shifting priorities, so to say. We do something, we get bored, and we do not want to do it. So then the answer is very difficult what to do. You give students a task not to browse, not to do, but just concentrate on that, and they are not used to it, and they get bored, and nothing comes out of it. You need training, like meditation, whatever, concentrating, trying to inhibit all those things that pop out. So maybe sometime in future our recommendations will be just to have extracurricular activities of training inhibition, training, let's say, concentration. So that's also one of the things that might be university, let's say, responsibility, like health, the same way attention.
like if you think in terms, thank you very much, in terms of like logically, yes, it's exactly what we should do. But I personally, I see it as, yeah, sorry for for big pharmas, but it's really like bringing the pain and the treatment at the same time. It's like, oh, look, and oh, hey, no worries, you can do some mindfulness now, and all is better. And yes, yeah, I do think that we should use these techniques for sure, because there is a shift in our cognitive functioning, and these techniques are being built at the same time to sort of alleviate the shifts and whatever the main cognitive functions that we're losing. But for I did not expand that. But for the main, for me, exactly for you, I think this deep reading and all the skills that come with it, or the cognitive functions that come with it, this is what worry me the most personally, for sure. And I think that one thing to do it also, actually I was having a conversation with my mom and my partner, and what they told me is, yes, but in a way they're not really endangered, because at the end of the day you will specialize in one thing as a human being. Obviously it's talking from privilege, because not everyone has the privilege to specialize in anything, but you will focus on one thing, and all the big scientists, the big politicians will focus on, will specialize, and by specializing they will sort of be forced to focus on at least, be experts in at least what they're doing. And I think it makes a point, because then yes, you do have at some point to focus on what you're doing, but I also think that it's not completely true, because then you can, the questions that we will be asking as scientists, as politicians, will be different questions, will be questions that we know that we can answer with the tools that we have, so in short term, etc. So yeah, again, no perfect answer, but it's a very, very interesting topic for sure. Thank you. We don't have time. Do you want to discuss? Wait, yes. Okay. Thank you, I'm so happy to answer. Thank you so much, really. Okay, perfect, I'm here, I don't know.
No, I just wanted to close.
Oh, yes, of course, thank you. Do you want me to sit again? I'm going back to my seat.
Thank you very much. And just one highlight. I'm sure there should be a best mix of many things. And it's a moving target, I believe. And I'm sure we're not going back to the previous one before COVID-19, but then we're moving forward, and which is going to be I would think this is a moving target for all of us to take initiatives and take ownership, and so. Thank you very much for today's Dr. Jo. Once again, applause.
Thank you very much.